A ragged stranger stumbled against her shop door, just as the first hard freeze of the season locked Juniper flat under ice, and Clara Voss had the door open and the man half inside before she'd properly decided to do it at all. "Sit," she said, steering him toward the stove before he could protest, taking in at a glance the threadbare coat gone through at both elbows, the boots cracked clean across the sole, the hollow, wind-burned look of a man who had walked further than his body had food to spare for. "You'll freeze to death out there before you find whatever it is you're looking for." "I'm looking for work," the stranger said, teeth chattering around the words, "and I'd not have troubled you, ma'am, if the wind hadn't near knocked me flat outside your window." "You're troubling no one." Clara set the kettle over the heat and did not ask his name yet, understanding instinctively that a man that cold needed warmth before he needed conversation. She was 26 years old, a seamstress by trade and necessity both, having taken over late Father Small's shop 3 winters back when his heart gave over his ledgers, and she had learned in those 3 winters exactly how thin the line ran between a full larder and an empty one. She recognized the particular exhaustion in the stranger's face because she had worn it herself, on harder days than she liked to remember. He gave his name eventually as Fletcher, no more than that, offered with the careful reticence of a man unused to explaining himself to strangers. And when Clara noticed him shivering still despite the stove's heat, she went without a word to the back room and returned with a coat she had been 3 weeks constructing from good wool a rancher's wife had traded her for hemming a wedding dress. A coat meant to be sold for badly needed cash come the Saturday market. "I can't take that," Fletcher said when she held it out to him. "You mean to sell it? I've nothing to pay you with." "I didn't ask for payment." Clara pressed it into his hands before he could refuse again. "A coat does a man no good hanging on my wall while he freezes in the street outside it. Wear it in good health, Mr. Fletcher, and think no more on the cost." He looked at her a long moment with an expression she could not entirely read, something between disbelief and a kind of wonder that seemed oddly larger than the gift deserved, and then he put the coat on, and thanked her in a voice gone rough with more than cold, and went back out into the freezing dusk before she could ask where he meant to sleep that night. She did not know, could not have known, that the ragged man she had warmed by her stove and sent off in her best coat was Fletcher Kingman, the same Fletcher Kingman whose name appeared on land deeds and railroad charters clear across 3 territories. A man who had grown so weary of being flattered and fleeced by people who knew his fortune before they knew his face that he had taken to traveling incognito. When he scouted new country for the rail line, he meant to run through the valley, dressed plain, carrying no more than a bag and a letter of credit sewn into his boot heel, precisely so he might see towns and people as they truly were, unpolished by the promise of his money. Juniper Flat, he had decided within a day of arriving, was a town worth seeing plainly. It was also, he'd quickly learned, a town in the grip of a man named Horace Pruitt, who ran the only bank for 40 miles, had spent the autumn quietly buying up notes and mortgages on half the valley's homesteads, waiting, it was whispered, for the moment his son Otis could marry into whatever remained worth having. Otis Pruitt had set his sights, some months back, on Clara Voss. "You'd want for nothing," Otis told her the second time he called at her shop that week, leaning against her counter in a manner that suggested he considered the space already partly his. "My father holds the note on this building, Miss Voss, same as he holds half the notes in this valley. A sensible woman would think on her future before she thinks on her pride." "I think on my future every day, Mr. Pruitt," Clara said, keeping her hands steady at her sewing though her voice wanted to shake. "I simply don't see you in it." He left with a look that promised the conversation was not finished, and Clara sat a long while after he'd gone with her needle idle in her lap, doing the arithmetic she did most nights now, the note her father had taken against the shop in a lean year, the interest that seemed to grow faster than her earnings ever could, the letter from the bank that had arrived that very morning reminding her the full balance came due with the spring thaw, with no mention of mercy attached to the reminder. Her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, who ran the little bakery 2 doors down and had known Clara since she was a girl trailing her father to church in dresses she'd outgrown, brought over a loaf still warm from the oven and sat with her a while that evening, as she often did when she sensed Clara needed company more than bread. Pruitt did the very same to the Hendersons last spring, the older woman said, breaking off a piece for each of them. Called their note early on some technicality nobody could quite make sense of, and when Tom Henderson couldn't raise the sum, Pruitt bought the homestead for a fraction of its worth, and sold it on to a rancher friend of his within the month. There's a pattern to it, if you look close enough. I've long suspected he manufactures the very debts he collects. Suspecting and proving are different animals, though, Clara said, and I've neither the money nor the standing to prove anything against a man who owns the only bank for 40 miles. No, Mrs. Abernathy agreed, patting her hand, but you've more friends in this town than you credit yourself with, dear. Don't let Pruitt convince you you're facing him alone. That's always been his favorite trick, making the frightened feel solitary, so they'll take whatever bargain he offers just to end the fear. Clara held on to those words longer than she expected to, turning them over on the nights that followed like a small stone kept in a pocket for comfort. And though they did not erase the mortgage or soften Pruitt's intentions, they reminded her, each time despair crept close, that she was not so entirely without allies as the bank's cold arithmetic liked to suggest. Fletcher returned to the shop 3 days later. This time with 2 torn shirts he claimed, unconvincingly, to have caught on a fence, and Clara mended them without asking further questions, noticing as she worked that his hands, though roughened, bore none of the calluses she'd expect on a genuine drifter, and that he watched the town through her shop window with an attentiveness that seemed less like idle curiosity and more like a man taking careful notes he meant to act on later. She said nothing of the observation. She had learned, running a shop alone in a town like Juniper Flat, that most people carried something they weren't yet ready to explain, and she extended Fletcher the same patience she would have wanted extended to herself. "You're kinder to strangers than this town deserves," Fletcher said one evening, watching her fold the mended shirts with the same careful attention she gave every piece of work, paid or not. "I've been 3 weeks in Juniper Flat now, and you're the first person who's offered me anything without first asking what I might be worth to them. Most people here have learned to guard what little they have," Clara said. "I don't blame them for it. I've simply decided I'd rather be poor and open-handed than poor and afraid. Fear costs more than kindness does, in my experience, even when kindness costs everything you've got to give." He was quiet a long moment, turning that over. "That's a rare philosophy for a woman with a mortgage coming due." Her head came up sharply. "How do you know about my mortgage?" "Pruitt's clerk talks too freely at the saloon," Fletcher said, which was true enough, though it was not the whole truth of how thoroughly he had already come to know the particulars of Clara Voss's situation. Having spent considerable quiet hours these past weeks looking into exactly who held power in Juniper Flat and how they had come to hold it, "I'd not worry over much, Miss Voss. Men like Pruitt rarely hold their power as firmly as they'd have folks believe." "That's easy philosophy for a drifter with nothing to lose," she said, though not unkindly, and turned back to her work, missing the flicker of something like guilt that crossed his face at the words. She learned some weeks later, quite by accident, that the Hendersons, the very family Mrs. Abernathy had spoken of, evicted the previous spring by Pruitt's manufactured debt, had unexpectedly recovered their homestead, purchased back for them by an anonymous benefactor who'd insisted, through a lawyer in the county seat, that his name never be revealed. Clara thought nothing of it at the time beyond a passing gladness for a family she barely knew, until she noticed Fletcher's absence from town for the better part of a week that same month, and his evasive, faintly embarrassed answer when she asked where his carpentry work had taken him. She'd not press him on it, but she began, without quite admitting it to herself, to watch him more closely, and to notice how often good fortune seemed to trail quietly in his wake wherever he went in Juniper Flat, never once claimed or announced. "You've a curious talent," she told him once, only half teasing, "for being nearby whenever something good happens to someone in this town, and always managing to look surprised about it after." "Coincidence," Fletcher said, not quite meeting her eyes, and busied himself with the woodpile rather than continue the conversation, and Clara let the matter drop, though she filed the observation away carefully, the way she filed away any piece of fabric too fine and too curious to have come from an ordinary drifter's meagre pack. The town held its winter social in the Grange Hall the 2nd week of December, and Clara nearly did not go, weighed down as she was by the mortgage's approaching deadline, until Mrs. Abernathy insisted she could not spend every evening bent over her ledgers and dragged her along by the arm. Fletcher was there too, having been invited, half out of curiosity and half out of the grudging welcome a town extends to a stranger who has proven himself useful with an axe and a hammer through a hard season, and when the fiddler struck up a reel, he crossed the hall to where Clara stood and asked, with a formality that seemed almost shy on so plain-spoken a man, whether she might do him the honor. She had not danced since before her father died, and she told him so, expecting he might withdraw the invitation. Instead he only said, "Then we'll be equally out of practice," and led her out among the other couples, and if his steps were somewhat surer than a genuine drifter's ought to have been, she was too caught up in the unfamiliar pleasure of the evening to examine the discrepancy too closely. "You dance like a man who's had lessons," she said, breathless midway through the second reel. A misspent youth, he was in its way entirely true, though not in the sense she took it, and she laughed, a real laugh, unguarded. The first she'd allowed herself in longer than she could readily recall, and something in his face, watching her laugh, went soft and unguarded in return. By the time the fiddler played the last waltz, and the hall began emptying into the cold night, half of Juniper Flat had warmed noticeably toward the quiet stranger who'd spent the evening attentive only to Clara Voss, and Clara herself walked home under a clear, star-thick sky, feeling lighter than the looming mortgage had allowed her to feel in months. Fletcher's borrowed coat, the very one she'd given him that first freezing evening, draped now over her own shoulders against the cold, since he had insisted, and she had not had the will to refuse him. Winter deepened, and with it, so did whatever had begun quietly growing between them. Fletcher took to appearing at the shop most evenings, ostensibly to trade small jobs of carpentry and hauling for meals. Clara insisted on feeding him regardless, though both of them had long since stopped pretending the arrangement was only about food and firewood. He fixed her sagging back step without being asked. She let out the seams of his borrowed coat when the cold finally put some flesh back on his too-thin frame, and neither of them remarked on the small domestic intimacy of the gesture, though both felt it plainly. "Why haven't you left?" she asked him one such evening, snow ticking soft against the window glass, the shop's single lamp throwing gold across the mending in her lap. "A man looking for work such as you claim to be. Surely there's better prospects than a snowbound valley town with one bank and one banker's son who'd like nothing better than to see you gone." "I've found reason enough to stay," Fletcher said, and the plainness of it, the lack of any of the practiced charm she imagined a wealthier man might have used on her, struck her harder than flattery ever could have. "I'd tell you the whole reason, Clara, if I thought you'd believe me." "Try me," she said. He almost did. She would think later of that almost for a long while, the way he opened his mouth, and something crossed his face that looked very much like the truth gathering itself to be spoken, and then Otis Pruitt's voice carried in from the street outside, loud and ugly with drink, announcing to no one in particular that Clara Voss would learn her place come spring one way or another, and the moment closed as quickly as it had opened. "Another time," Fletcher said instead, jaw gone tight, and left soon after, and Clara told herself the disappointment she felt was only foolishness, a poor woman's fancy for a poor man who owed her nothing but honest gratitude. The first real warning came a week later, when Clara woke to find her shop's front window shattered, glass scattered clean across the bolts of cloth she'd left folded near the display, and a note weighted down with a stone reading only that stubborn women sometimes learned costly lessons. She had no proof it was Otis Pruitt's doing, nor his father's, but she needed none to understand the message's intent, and she swept the glass with hands that would not quite stop trembling, refusing to let the fear show on her face when half the street gathered to gawk at the damage. Fletcher arrived within the hour, summoned by Mrs. Abernathy, and the fury on his face when he saw the wreckage was unlike anything Clara had yet witnessed in him, a cold, controlled anger entirely unlike the mild-mannered drifter he'd presented himself as for months. He said nothing about the note, only set to work at once boarding the window with lumber he seemed to produce from nowhere, and when she thanked him, he caught her hand and held it a moment longer than the task required. "I'll not let anyone frighten you out of what's yours, Clara," he said, low and fierce. "Whatever it costs to see this stopped. You're one man with a hammer and a borrowed coat, Fletcher," she said, half despairing, half moved beyond words by the ferocity in his voice. I'm grateful for it truly. But I fear a hammer's no match for a banker's greed. You'd be surprised, he said, what a determined man can bring to bear, when he's finally found something worth defending, and something in the quiet certainty of it stayed with her long after he'd finished the window and gone, a small stubborn ember of hope she did not yet dare name. The blow fell in late February, earlier than the bank's letter had promised, when Horace Pruitt himself came to the shop with 2 deputies and a notice of foreclosure, citing a clause in her father's original note, one Clara had never seen before, in ink that looked, to her practiced seamstress's eye for fine and careful work, suspiciously fresh against the yellowed page around it, that allowed the bank to call the debt early upon any evidence the property's value had increased, which Pruitt now claimed it plainly had, given rumours of a coming railroad spur. You've 3 days to vacate, Miss Voss, unless you can produce the full balance, Pruitt said, not troubling to hide his satisfaction, or unless my son's offer still stands, in which case the matter resolves itself rather more pleasantly. That clause is forged, Clara said, staring at the page, her voice steadier than she felt. My father would never have signed a note with such terms. I know his hand, Mr. Pruitt, better than anyone living, and that is not it. Prove it in a courtroom, then if you've the money for lawyers, Pruitt said, and left her standing in the wreckage of 3 years' careful survival with 3 days to find a debt she had no earthly way of raising. She found Fletcher that evening not at her shop, but at the edge of town. Standing with a surveyor's instrument over a stretch of open land she had always known simply as the North Pasture, and something in the sight of him there, purposeful, commanding, utterly unlike the uncertain drifter who had once stumbled through her door, made her stop short. Understanding arriving in her chest a half-breath before he turned and saw her. Fletcher, she said, and then, because the truth was suddenly, unmistakably plain in the fine boots he no longer troubled to disguise, and the men who deferred to him at 20 paces, or whoever you truly are. He set down the instrument and crossed to her without hesitation, no longer hiding anything. Fletcher Kingman, he said. I own the rail company surveying this valley, Clara, and I've owned considerably more besides for longer than I care to admit to a woman I've let believe otherwise for 3 months. I should have told you the truth the first week. I told myself I was protecting the survey, but the truth is I wanted, for once in my life, to be loved for the man I am rather than the money I carry, and you gave me that without ever once asking my worth. I did not know how to give it up once I'd found it. Clara stood very still, feeling something complicated move through her, not quite anger, though anger was in it, and not quite hurt, though hurt was there too, tangled together with a strange, dizzying relief that the man she had come to care for was, underneath the deception, still entirely himself. You let me worry over feeding you, she said finally, when you could have bought this whole valley twice over without noticing the cost. I let you feed me because it was the first honest kindness anyone had shown me in longer than I can say, Fletcher said. I'm not sorry for accepting it, Clara, only sorry for the lie that let me keep accepting it as long as I did. I mean to make that right, starting now if you'll let me, she asked, needing to understand, needing the whole shape of it before she could decide what she felt. Why travel in rags at all, if you've fortune enough to spare yourself the trouble? He was quiet a moment, looking out over the valley he meant, eventually, to reshape. My father built his first fortune from nothing, and by the time I was grown, every acquaintance I owned, every woman who ever smiled at me across a ballroom, wanted something measured in dollars rather than in anything truer. I buried him 3 years back and inherited the whole weight of it, and I found within a season that I could no longer tell affection from appetite in anyone I met. So I started traveling plain, when the work allowed it, not to deceive exactly, only to find once more whether a person could still want me for something other than what I could give them. He looked at her steady. You never once asked what I could give you, Clara, not in 3 months. You only ever asked if I was warm enough and fed enough, and that plain, unasking kindness is the truest gift anyone's offered me since my father died. Clara felt something in her chest loosen at that, the last of her guarded anger softening into something closer to grief for the loneliness he'd described, a loneliness not so very different in shape from her own. That sounds a hard way to live, she said. Trusting no kindness because you can't tell its motive. It was, he said, until a freezing evening in a stranger's shop taught me motive isn't so hard to read after all, if a person's watching close enough. Pruitt means to take my shop in 3 days, she said, testing him, needing to know whether the wealth changed the man or merely revealed him. Pruitt, Fletcher said, and something cold and final moved behind his eyes, does not know yet that I hold the note on his bank's own overextended debts, purchased quietly these past 2 weeks precisely because I suspected a man like him would eventually overreach with someone I cared for. He will learn it tomorrow, in front of whichever portion of this town cares to watch. He was as good as his word. Word had already spread through Juniper Flat by dawn that the ragged drifter who'd wintered at Clara Voss's shop was, in fact, Fletcher Kingman himself. And by the time the bank opened its doors, the crowded street outside held nearly half the town. Some come from curiosity, most come from the same quiet hope Mrs. Abernathy had voiced weeks before, that a reckoning long overdue might finally be at hand. In the crowded front room of Pruitt's own bank, Fletcher Kingman produced not only the notes that made Horace Pruitt answerable to him rather than the reverse, bought quietly, note by note, from the very correspondent banks in the territorial capital that had once extended Pruitt's own overreaching credit, but a second document besides, the original, unaltered mortgage on Clara's father's shop, which his lawyer had ridden 3 days through hard weather to retrieve from the county courthouse's own filed copy, proving beyond any argument that the clause Pruitt had presented was exactly the forgery Clara had claimed it to be. This ink, Fletcher said, holding the forged clause up to the window light for the whole room to see, is barely 4 months old. Pruitt laid over a page aged to look decades older. Any competent clerk could see it, if he troubled to look rather than simply trust the man holding the pen. I'd wager it's not the only such clause in your files. I mean to have every note in this bank independently reviewed, starting today, and I mean to see every family you've cheated made whole again. A murmur ran through the gathered crowd, low and rising, particular sound of a town's long-suppressed grievances finally finding room to breathe. Horace Pruitt, gone grey around the mouth, tried once to bluster his way past the accusation, invoking his standing, his decades in the valley, the impropriety of a stranger, however wealthy, upending a town's established order on a seamstress's say-so. But the room's mood had already tipped decisively against him, and his own clerk, a nervous young man named Witt who had clearly been waiting years for the courage this moment finally lent him, stepped forward to confirm, in a shaking voice, that Mr. Pruitt kept a second set of ledgers in the back office that did not always match the figures shown to borrowers. You'll return every note you've forged or falsified in this valley, Fletcher told Pruitt, in front of half the town crowded into the bank to witness a reckoning long overdue. Or I'll see you answer for fraud before a circuit judge, and I promise you, Pruitt, I've the resources to make certain that answering is thorough. He set Clara's true, unaltered mortgage on the counter and, before the banker could reply, tore it cleanly in half. The debt's cleared. Paid in full this morning by me. Miss Voss owes this bank nothing further, now or ever. Otis Pruitt, who had come to gloat and instead found himself watching his father's small empire crumble in real time, made one last attempt at bluster, some sputtering claim about impropriety and interference. But the room's sympathy had turned entirely against the Pruitts by then, half the valley's homesteaders present having their own grievances against notes that had grown mysteriously larger than the sums they remembered borrowing, and Fletcher's calm, thorough dismantling of the family's schemes over the following weeks, auditing every note, forgiving every fraudulent clause, restoring fair terms to families who had spent years afraid of losing everything, did more to win Juniper Flat's trust than any fortune alone could have purchased. Clara found him again that evening at her shop, where he'd returned, quiet and uncertain in a way the powerful man from the bank that morning had not been, as though he feared the true reckoning still waited for him there, rather than at Pruitt's counter. I owe you an apology deeper than the one I gave in the street, he said. You gave me kindness with nothing to gain from it, Clara, and I repaid that honesty with months of pretending to be less than I was. I'd understand if that's a debt harder to forgive than any note Pruitt ever forged. You repaid it plainly enough this morning, Clara said, though she kept a careful distance still, needing to say the rest of it aloud. But I'd have you know, Fletcher Kingman, that I never once gave you that coat, or those meals, or this. She gestured at the space between them, unable quite to name it. Because I hoped for a fortune in return. I gave it because you were cold and hungry, and it cost me little enough to ease that. If you'd stayed a drifter the whole of your days, I'd have cared for you exactly the same. I know that, he said, quiet and certain. That's precisely why I fell in love with you, Clara Voss, somewhere between the coat and the mended shirts and every evening since. Because you're the first person in my adult life who loved the man before she ever knew the money existed to love instead. She let him close the distance then. Let him take her hands in his, work roughened still despite the fortune behind them. And when he kissed her it tasted less like a land baron's triumph than like the plain, hard-won relief of two people who had each, in their own way, been starving for something honest and had finally, against every reasonable expectation, found it in each other. Spring came to Juniper Flat with the rail survey stakes marching steadily up the valley, and true to the whispers that had first brought Fletcher there in disguise, he did come, by the time the thaw was complete, to hold deed or influence over nearly every acre of it, not through Prout's cruel arithmetic of forged notes and cornered debtors, but through fair purchase and fairer terms, a valley's worth of families sleeping easier for his coming rather than fearing it. Clara Voss became Clara Kingman that same spring, married in the very shop where she'd once pressed a homemade coat into a stranger's cold hands, wearing a dress she'd sewn herself from cloth finer than anything she'd ever dared touch before that winter, surrounded by a town that had learned. Alongside her, the difference between a man's fortune and his worth, she kept the shop running still, out of stubbornness and pride and a genuine love for the work, though she no longer needed the income to survive, and she liked to tell newcomers to Juniper Flat, when they marveled that the wealthiest man in 3 territories had married a plain seamstress, that she had not married a fortune at all. She had only ever warmed a freezing stranger by her stove and given him a coat off her own wall, and everything that came after, the valley, the wealth, the whole transformed town, had simply been what kindness, given without calculation, eventually returned to the woman generous enough to offer it first. The Hendersons came to the wedding, and so did a dozen other families who had, in the months since the bank's reckoning, found their notes quietly forgiven or their terms fairly restructured under Fletcher's new ownership, and the Grange Hall that evening held more genuine laughter than Juniper Flat had heard in years, Mrs. Abernathy declaring loudly over her third slurred slice of wedding cake that she had known. The very week the ragged stranger first appeared shivering at Clara's door, that something remarkable was quietly taking root in that little shop. Otis Prout had left the valley entirely by then, his father's influence beyond repair, and Horace himself remained only on Fletcher's forbearance and a strict new accounting overseen by honest hands, a fallen man permitted to keep his dignity so long as he troubled no one further. Clara still had the coat, mended and remended over the years until scarcely any of the original wool remained, and she kept it folded in the cedar chest at the foot of their bed rather than sold or discarded, a plain reminder, whenever she opened the lid, of the exact moment a poor woman's small, unthinking generosity had changed the whole shape of her life, not because she had calculated any return on it, but precisely because she never had.